These people are having a simple fight, a stick fight. But tabuki, as they call it, or tabuka, is meant to resemble swords, as you can see, but these are stick fights. And you can see that there's a lot of setting up, meaning there's a lot of pretending like you're going to do something, and then only afterwards you do it when you feel you've outwitted the opponent. Now, having a martial art like this in the Tuaregs and other North Africans, you would think that there would be easy similarities to draw between them and the people of Algeria. But for some reason, people don't do this. For example, El Matrag. El Matrag is a type of fighting in Algeria. Algeria is in Africa, if you don't know. And we read here, it is difficult to accurately trace the history of the sport, but it is certain that it is in the cradle is the Oran province, that is the northwest region of Algeria, and it appeared more than 2 centuries ago, according to some sources. The shepherds of this region have defended themselves in this way against herd thieves. However, it seems that this sport originally has its roots in war because the moves are very similar to saber techniques. Now, I want to say this again. Tabuka, the name of it, the one that I showed you in the beginning, literally translates to saber. And if you see the way they're fighting, it's exactly the same as any other stick fighting in Africa. Now, most El Matrag fights do not actually have a shield. Therefore, there needs to be less setup. But as you can see, setup are absolutely allowed. The only problem is, in order to set up without a shield, you have to move very back because the other opponent will strike you. But you can see these circular movements that are also done in other African ways of fighting. Now, it is not difficult to assume that a sport that you can see literally in North Africa is transmuted into this other one. But we do not need to compare it to a double stick fighting when we can compare it to a single one, like Bayesian stick fighting, which has its origins in Africa. Just like the sport of El Matrag, you can see here that because they use a single stick, they need a lot of setup. And also, when they actually engage each other, they have to use that single stick not only as an attack, but as a defense. Now, this was also used by the Maroons in America. The Maroons, if you don't know, have their foundations in Africa, which is obvious given the fact that they are Africans. And you see how if you were to put these side by side, El Matrag and Thingy and Bayesian stick fighting, it's called Bayesian stick fighting, but it's really African stick fighting. If you put them next to each other, you can see that they use the exact same techniques. Why do they look like they're using a sword though? Why would these African tribes who are using sticks to fight each other, why do they look like they're using a sword? That's because it's a very specific technique. This is a very specific technique. You see how it's very sword like in the way that it attempts to attack? It's kind of because it's training for sword fighting or for a weapon that would have some sharp side to it. But without swords, it can be effective completely on its own. Now, in the thing we read, they say that they don't know how old this stick fighting is because, of course, when you trace it with the sword fighting, it doesn't make sense that it's this young, especially the fact that it's mainly practiced by people who are more tribal in Algeria. But if you look at the ancient Egyptians, you will see that there is something that today they call tatib. I just think it's African stick fighting again. And you can see that the techniques are the same. A setup arm and then a stick, which is basically being used as a shield. Now, there is no reason to not use the second stick as an attack. There is no reason for doing this besides literally trying to mimic a shield while the other stick mimics some kind of weapon, maybe even a blade. And that's what is assumed by most historians when it comes to this type of fighting, that the stick is meant to represent some kind of blade, and the shield is supposed to represent a shield. The stick is supposed to represent a shield. Now, the way they're going to attack, if you pay attention, it's going to be the same as Al Matrag, the same as Bayesian stick fighting, the same as Nguni stick fighting, the same as Ugandan stick fighting, in that there's a lot of setup, and then you have to go around it and you have to hit the opponent like you would hit him with a sword. Now, if you've got enough momentum, you hit somebody, they're literally going to fall from the pain. This remake of Egyptian sword fighting, using the same techniques that you see in African stick fighting, and of course in El Matrag, and in other forms of stick fighting, you can see there's a lot of setup. There's a lot of just looking over, spinning of the sticks. You see, there's a lot of set. Just come here, come get me, and you will see it the same way all over. And of course, clashing of shields happens when you actually are in real battle, because you do not stick to friendly battle in war. Now, if we compare this style to the one in the North Africans, the Tuareg, you can see that they look almost identical in the way they're fighting because of the size of the shield. When you compare it to other African forms of fighting, like this one from Deep Africa, you can see that the techniques are identical. And again, you see how they use the stick as a shield. Using the stick as a shield, unlike things like Kalari Payatu, where you use both of them as weapons, is a very arbitrary rule. As you can see here, it's very effective to have both sticks to attack, unless, of course, the invention of this sport was to parry off blades. And therefore, you need this arbitrary rule, because you won't have it in a case of a real war. Now, some places might have just kept it, remembered it as a rule, but lost the ability to make swords. Well, no one really lost the ability to make swords, because all African kingdoms had some form of thing to make swords. But using swords might not be the first priority, as a lot of them used spears or whatever. But the concept is basically the same. And in some cases, they use maces, which would be way more effective than a stick. But usually, these are for sport. Once you get to war, it's usually a blade. In some cases, it is replaced with some kind of very loose weapon like a whip. And you can see here that without a giant shield, these people would basically be in trouble. And the best part about this is one strike that goes through. This is why there's so much setup and there's so much defense. And one strike that goes through will knock you down on the ground. Now, tell me why this is not the same as any of the other martial arts that I've shown you, especially Tatib in Egypt. So, what should we take away from this? Well, let's check some things. One, this type of fighting is very unique. Now, I do not say that no other place in the world doesn't have this at all, but nowhere near Africa does anybody have this type of fighting. Only Africans have this fighting. But not only do they have it full, meaning they don't have it hidden somewhere in archives or anything. If you just Google stick fighting in Africa or stick fighting in North Africa or even stick fighting in Egypt, you will find it immediately. Google stick fighting in the Middle East or Europe, and nothing close to this will come up. There's stick fighting in those regions, but the techniques are very different. The only one I can think of is Kalari Payatu in India, where they use a shield and a spring sword. That's the closest that is similar to this, but you can tell you would never make a similarity between Indian fighting over other African fighting as a place of origin when they're so close to each other and then they share it throughout. So just like how I showed dances and songs and drummings and all these other things that are similar within African histories which were passed on, you can see here that this one too was passed on. Now you're probably thinking, okay, so dances and everything is passed on, but why are you using places so far away from Egypt or whatever? And I'll say, I don't have to. At the bottom, I introduce the Mercy tribe fighting the same stick fighting, meaning that people who are in Sudan, and many people do this, they call it Donga in the Dinkas, and they have other names for it in other Sudanese tribes. And just like these ones, even the Maasai have this, just like these guys, they fight the exact same way. And so we can see here over five different types of people who would be considered different ethnic groups with different linguistic languages and whatever, they all have this similarity. So, for example, let's take the one at the bottom, the Sudanese, which are Nilotic. We've got the Egyptians, which are Afro-Asiatic. We've got the Berbers, which are also Afro-Asiatic. We have the Chadic way of fighting, which is similar to this, which is Afro-Asiatic. And then we have the Bantu version, which is which is Bantu. And then we have the Niger version of this, which is the one that gave birth to Bajan stick fighting, which is similar to this. So all the people of Africa are represented in this. We started off with a single stick fighting, so it's best we finish off with a single stick fighting because all of these tribes also use the same technique. Because what do you do if you drop your shield? Do you just run away? Well, you switch to the single stick technique, and you can see with this Ethiopian tribe that they also have this single stick technique. So using single stick is not out of the question, just like the people who are using it in Bayesian stick fighting and also in Algeria. And also, they also use it sometimes in Tatib. You can see it in Egyptian paintings with one stick sometimes. This technique does not change. The way they're fighting, if you look at it, it's still exactly the same. And it has the same roots as any of the other stick fighting. And how do you know? Because in North Africa, if you look, there's a dual stick fighting and then there's a single stick fighting. West Africa, dual, single. Central Africa, dual, single. Sudanese, dual, single. Ancient Egyptian, dual, single. So you cannot say they do not match each other when you literally see them being called by the same name and they have this double where you have a dual and a single. And of course, the transmutation of weapons you saw with the South African version that I showed you, they had whips instead of a sword or a mace or even a stick. Speaking of Black Warriors, I'd like to thank Black Rampage for donating $19.99 in my previous video. You really do help me continue make these videos, and I am still trying to work on some kind of animation. For everybody else, please like, subscribe, share. Make sure you get the videos out there, because if you notice, most of the videos that I make that get a lot of views come from some negative people. So if you can help, please push these positive videos to go at least past 1,000 views. And so I don't need to rely on some of those videos, because they do get incentivized by the algorithm and will be made, because of course I don't make them negative, but people gravitate to them. So please like, share, subscribe these positive videos, and tell other people to watch them. Watch them twice if you have to.